Hi guys, welcome to Inktober. I'm going to try and keep this part of the video as quick and short as possible because the rest of it's quite long. The reason why I decided to add this little portion at the beginning is because the rest of it is me demonstrating how to create a swatch, how to do image searches, how to sketch from start to finish, and how to ink from start to finish. But a lot of you guys may not actually need me to demonstrate that. You may not need to watch it. If you want to watch just a portion of it, that's why there are timestamps. Otherwise, I'm just going to explain everything real quick at the beginning right now, and that way you can either use the checklist in the description of this video and on Google Classroom and skip the demonstration portion of this video. So for swatches are there basically for you to test out your materials. So you want to gather up all of your black markers, all of your black pens, or if you only have one, and then maybe a brush if you can, and some water. And you're basically going to test that out on a piece of scrap paper to see what happens if you add layers, what happens if you add water, what happens if you mix a pen and a marker together, and that way you can really see what it looks like before you use it on a work of art. So that's what the swatch is there for. For visual aids, you can either save images throughout your life, which is what I do very frequently, either on Instagram or Pinterest or whatever it is that you use. And then the other way, which is also very, very easy and very useful, is to use Google Images. So just go onto Google, look up any term that you want, and then go to Images and save any images that work. Now, you may find something immediately, which is magic. You may not. And if you don't, you want to switch your terminology. If you look up kid compared to child compared to teen, you're going to get very different things. If you look up drawing of a lion, which will help you draw a lion better than looking at a real image of a lion, it's going to give you different images than looking up an actual lion. If you look up silhouette of something, anything, silhouette of a dog, silhouette of a hat, silhouette of a lamp, it really helps with drawing. It does for me on a very constant basis. So you can try that out as well. So that's for image searches. Make sure that you have enough so that you can draw to your heart's content. And then for sketching, you want to start by creating a frame. So you want some space on either end of your paper. That way, if you need the space later, you have it. Also, just makes it look more professional. Then you're going to start with your basic shapes. Basic shapes take 3 seconds to draw and 3 seconds to erase, and we're not emotionally attached to those basic shapes, right? There's circles and rectangles and triangles. It doesn't matter. We're using those to make sure that we have enough space for everything in our drawing and to make sure that they're placed in the center or properly on our paper. Once you have the basic shapes down and you know that you have enough space and that they're placed properly, you can start sculpting in and adding more and more detail as you go until you're really satisfied with your drawing. Then you're going to erase unnecessary lines and you're ready to start inking. For inking, you want to start with an outline with the thinnest pen you have. Sometimes you want to leave some of the outlines open where there's just like a line that drips open and then goes back out. That way your eye has to connect both of those lines together to finish the outline, and that actually makes everything look far more realistic. That doesn't work if you need something to have like a very high contrast, but if it's just something to keep in mind. So the thinner your outline and the more there are kind of like open spaces between lines, the more flexibility you'll have later on in your drawing. And then basically you just want to keep inking. You want to work in layers because if you go too dark too quickly, there's no way of going back. And one of the drawings that I did, I had that problem, and it is what it is. So just keep in mind, also sometimes it's good not to overwork your work. But for inking, you basically start with a very simple outline. You erase any lines that you can when you can, and then you just keep working. So you can either work in ink washes or work with hatching, cross hatching, and stippling, or do a combination of both. The possibilities are endless. So feel free to either watch the demonstration or skip it. Contact me if you have any questions, and I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. I hope you'll have as much fun as I did drawing these drawings for this video. All right, see you soon. Swatch making time. Grab all your materials and test them out. I'm doing hatching, cross hatching, and a swirl with my pencil, and then now my pen set that goes from 0.3 to 0.8. So it's going to go from light to dark simply with the thickness of my pen. I put washi tape at the end of my pens just to be able to tell which ones are thicker, faster. Next, I'm testing out my thin eraser and my thicker one. Next, I'm testing out my ruler. And now on to ink pens. So ink pens have India ink in them, and they're wonderful. They can get quite messy. They're slightly more expensive than most pens, but they're a good investment and they last a long time. So right now all I'm doing is I'm testing out what it feels like to try and fill in an area, trying to create a swirl. And now I'm grabbing a water brush, but you could grab any paintbrush and just a cup of water. And I'm testing out how much I can lift up from the ink. Now, India ink is waterproof once dry, but when it's still wet, as you can tell, you can grab some of the ink. It is going to be difficult, though, to create something that is gradual. So I'm going to have to keep kind of going back and forth between the ink and the water. Now, you may like that look right now because this is a swatch. swatch, the whole point is to experiment and see what happens, and we don't really care if it comes out looking good or looking not so good. Also, what we want to do when we're creating a swatch is test out what happens with our materials when we use multiple layers. With my black pens, I've used them so much I don't really need to do that, and you have an idea of how that works if you've doodled in class. With ink pens, however, you don't know how all inks work. This ink pen specifically that I'm testing out right now, unfortunately, it dries really shiny, which is really frustrating if I want to take pictures of my work. The one I'm grabbing right now and I'm messing up with because I hadn't used it since last October is a watered down ink, so it's like a grayish color. I love this thing. I always start with this one and then make my way back, and I really like to add some water to make it even lighter because the gray is quite dark. And so again, right now all I'm doing is kind of testing out layers of pen, what happens when I use the gray on top of the black, what happens when I add water, etc., etc. Now I'm testing out how thin I can make my lines, how much I can control them. Now I'm going to try and create some hatchings and cross hatchings and see how that goes. I'm speeding up the video as much as I can just because this is getting really long. And again, like, I'm gonna try different shapes, try and go from light to dark, see if the lines show up. You definitely see streak lines when you use ink brush pens compared to a alcohol marker. This is the alcohol marker. It's super flat. The color is not as full, right? It's not as profound, but you don't see any streaks whatsoever, which is quite wonderful. Now I'm going to test out my white pens. I have a gel pen and then I have an ink pen. The ink pen, the brush pen, always dries out, so it's quite complicated to use. These gel pens are really great. Both of these are good. The brush pen is much more translucent as opposed to the gel pen that is pretty opaque. Now what I'm going to do is something I should have done way ahead of time, but I forgot to do, which is just create gradation using ink washes. So these again are very potent ink brush pens, so it's better to just water it down first and use that for the majority of it, and then just add the actual full pigmentation of the brush pen at the very edge, just to see how it goes from light to dark. And I'm going to do the same thing with my black one, just to test it out. And this is quite hard because the pigment in ink is much stronger than it would be in watercolor or anything else. Not stronger, but it's just harder to make it go super duper light. So you definitely want to use watered down washes for your light areas, and paper towels are definitely your friend. You can just dab that and it'll look quite good. So for a swatch, get all your materials together, test them out, doing the similar thing. See what happens when you add multiple layers, see what happens when you mix and match, and use gradation. Now on to our visual aids. So to look up a visual aid, you're either going to save stuff or use Google Images. So I'm looking for goldfish in water. And it's pretty quick for me to find the images that I want. I'm going to go ahead and save those to my camera roll. Now I'm going to go ahead and look for something more challenging, which is the type of image I want of kids in a hallway at school. And so I'm looking for things, I'm saving images as I go. I had to use a couple different types of terminology. Now I'm looking at cool kids. I'm not really finding what I'm looking for, so I'm looking at cool students instead. So I'm changing the terminology in order to find pictures that I like better. These are all the images that I saved in order to create the drawing that you're going to see me create now. So for sketching, make sure that you have your visual aids, and you're going to start with basic shapes, then you're going to perfect your shapes, you're going to add details, and you're going to erase unnecessary lines. So I went ahead and created a frame for myself. In this sketchbook, it's pretty narrow, so my frame is really close to the actual spiral. I strongly suggest you do not do that and have a thicker frame, but again, I draw very frequently, so I'm used to it. So now what I'm doing is just creating the basic shape of my student's body language, and I'm going to realize pretty quickly that it is not centered. So I'm grabbing my ruler and really seeing where the center of my square is, and then I'm going to basically alter my shape and make the body a little bit thicker on one side based off of that middle line. Now that I'm perfecting the shape, you want to pay attention to how frequently I erase. So I'm setting up the arms. She has a really bulky sweater on. At first, I give her the straight hair that's on my visual aid, and then I eventually made her look more like me. You can see that her arm right now looks super hulkish. I'm going to have to erase it. And you're going to see me erase hands and different areas multiple times, and yet that basic shape is going to stay the same. Sometimes a very slight variation will make a difference. That obviously looks terrible as a sweater, so I just kind of shift it. The prompt for this drawing is fish, and I interpreted it as like someone who's brand new somewhere. It's often terminology in prison, actually. And then also, my first day of high school, I wore a long sleeve shirt that had like realistically printed goldfish and water on it, to the point where friends I made later thought I like shared with me that they thought I was completely insane on the first day of school. And my principal actually said to me, "Ah, ça va être comme un poisson dans l'eau," which means it's going to be like a fish in water. And to this day, I'm embarrassed that I wore that shirt. But not really. So right now I'm working on the face. Faces this small are quite difficult to draw for the most of us. And when you're doing that, you really want to pay attention to the angle of your eyebrows. And then with your eyes, you don't want to fill in a full almond shape. You want to have some open lines so that the eye of the person who's looking at your drawing has to connect the various tiny lines you've created for the eyes. I want her to look scared right now. She looks kind of annoyed. So I'm going to change the angle of the eyebrows, and I'm going to realize that I have to do that based on my visual aid, which is why they're important. And then for the eyes, because she's scared, usually when someone's scared, the eyes are really big, so the eyeballs are not connected to the eyelashes, and that's something that I'm going to do to make the shape of her face look better. As in, give me the expression that I want. So it's quite difficult. And then I showed this drawing to someone and they said, "Oh, is she scared or is she cold?" And she's supposed to be scared, but whatever. I'm just going to keep working on this. Now I'm reworking this to make her have curly hair so that she looks more like me as opposed to like the girl in the visual aid that I used. And let's say that you wanted to look up curly hair or a specific hairstyle. You could just add a different visual aid to use in order to do that. So here I am fixing the eyebrows again, and I'm all set. Now I'm going to start working on my background, and here you see a perfect example or demonstration of why it's important to do the basic shapes first and then add detail. Is that I did the basic shapes, I didn't like it, and I erased them. Even though this video is sped up, it still really just took me maybe 30 seconds to figure out if I liked the placement of the extra kids in the background like that. And once I didn't, I changed it. Mostly because I didn't want it to look like the kids in the background were talking to her or knew her. She's supposed to look scared on her first day of school while everybody else kind of looks relaxed and is with their own group of friends. So now I'm going ahead and creating the basic shape for the people that are going to be in the background, and I'm going to be doing a heck of a lot of erasing. Initially, I had sped up this video so much to make it faster, but I slowed it down a little bit so you could see me working on the details. So once I have the basic shapes, here again, I'm going to work on this. It took me a while to get the proper placement of the legs for her. Her proportions were super weird at first, and the other girl as well. And at first, I went for what I knew, which to speed up the process of creating. She was wearing like a skirt, and then I actually paid closer attention to the visual aid and tried to make it look a little bit more realistic. So for things like this, like the background, for example, on Inktober, if I didn't have enough time to create a really complicated background, I could have just stuck with her, right, and just focus on her, on the drawing of her. Over here, I'm giving him way too big of a forehead, so I'm going to work on making it smaller later. For heads and profiles, I always struggle, so it always takes me forever. But the key is just to keep reworking, and that's the beauty of drawing lightly and of starting with basic shapes, is that you can really kind of work and rework and erase. And sometimes you may say, well, that doesn't look quite realistic, but it'll do. And sometimes you can say, no, I really want to keep reworking this until it looks a little bit better. At first, she looked like way older with the chin I gave her, this girl, so then I erased it and kind of fixed that up. And she's the one where I kind of was lazy and created a profile that I thought looked fine, but it didn't look realistic. And then I decided, I think this is where I'm doing it. Yeah, I'm giving her like a skirt. I'm going to give her a skirt, and it's not going to look realistic at all. And then I was like, okay, fine. So then I looked at my visual aid, and I erased it and created her so that she looked more like she was kind of mid-walk. Although right now I'm working on his book and his hand, which was not the easiest to do just because it's so small. So there I am creating that kind of like skirt thing, and it doesn't look right at all. I'm trying to make it so that her phone is in her hand. And then I'm going to take the extra 5 minutes, right, to erase that part of her body and draw it in a way that looks far more realistic. Sometimes you have the time to do that, sometimes you don't. Both are fine. I just wanted to point that out to you, that there are all different kinds of levels of detail that you can create on someone in a drawing, and it's up to you to decide how far you want to go, or when you want to just say whatever, it's fine. Okay, so that's something for you to figure out as an artist yourself. Next, I'm going to be working on, I'm going to erase, I think, unnecessary lines, and then I'm going to start working on creating the goldfish on the shirt. So that's going to take a little while for me. I'm going to speed up this video a little bit. I erased unnecessary lines, I tightened up some of the shapes, and then I started inking. So I grabbed my 0.3 pen, that's the thinnest black pen that I have, and I basically started to outline everything. I only outlined shapes that I knew I wanted defined, otherwise I would have left those kind of undone. But I used a 0.3 pen so that either way I could have gone and kind of ignored them later on, because a 0.3 is so thin compared to the inking that I'm going to do. Then I waited for everything to dry and I erased everything. Now what I'm doing is I'm going over the outline that I know I want to be the most contrasted. I want her to stick out from the rest of the drawing. So I'm going around her right now with my 0.8, and I'm creating a nice thick contrasted dark line so that she will stand out compared to everybody else in the drawing. The next thing I do is block out areas that I know I want to be dark. I wanted her pants to be black, but just in case, I'm making everything kind of gray. Everyone in the background should be darker than her, kind of so that they look like they're the background, but obviously when you're working with a grayscale, you can't make everything black or everything kind of will blend into one another. So now what I'm doing is I'm going around the people in the background with my 0.8, because I have way more control over my 0.8 than I do over my brush pen. Initially what I wanted to do was create a background that went from very, very dark to very light. I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to realize pretty quickly that it's not going to look good. It's going to draw attention to the background instead of drawing attention to the people. So soon enough, everything in the background will be fully black using the black pen. It just takes me a little while to figure it out. The key is to start light and then keep reworking. I actually reworked this drawing a little too much. I wish I had stopped a little bit sooner. I went really dark with this one. But when you're using ink washes or you're using ink pen techniques like stippling, hatching, and cross hatching, start light. You can always go darker, but once those lines are there, it's really tough to lift them up, even if you're going to use a white gel pen or something like that. So now that I have a background that I'm kind of comfortable with, at least for now, I'm waiting for it to dry. I'm starting to add details into various people in my drawing. So right now what I'm doing is I am working on that girl's clothing and that girl's hair, and I made part of her head a little too dark, so I'm going to go in with a white gel pen later on and add a little bit more hair. But right now what I'm doing is just adding definition. And sometimes I don't quite know where to go, right? So sometimes it's good to take a little bit of time. So now I'm adding definition onto the main character's pants with my pen. So when you're using a gel pen or like a pen that you would normally write with, it creates a very different type of line definition once it dries than when you use the brush pens, which is why they're really good for, you know, going over outlines to make them nice and strong, nice and contrasted, nice and precise, if that's what you want. If you don't want them to be precise, obviously don't do that. Don't overwork it. So now I'm using gray wash. So it's gray ink to create her hair. Her hair is supposed to be dark. And then for other people, I'm going to be kind of mixing my gray ink with some water as well. Again, I really wish I had kind of stopped working on this drawing after I started doing the gray washes, because I feel like it looked kind of cooler than what it does when it's done. But that's part of it, right? The beauty of Inktober, the beauty of creating 31 drawings in 31 days and not having too much time to overthink it, and not being upset if one or two drawings don't come out looking so great, or even if half of the drawings don't come out looking so great. If you feel like you can't draw and you want to learn how to draw, the best way to do it is to practice and to kind of take away any kind of like stock you've put into your drawing. So if you go into a drawing saying, well, this is what I'm doing today for an hour, or 20 minutes, or 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, if you do it every day, if half your drawings aren't that great, you're not really going to care, because the other half are going to be awesome, right? So the key is just to try to experiment, and then if it doesn't come out looking as great as you wished it had, then you've learned a lesson. So in this one, I was reminded that sometimes you should quit while you're ahead, and sometimes, you know, gray washes are enough. So as you can tell, this takes a while. This video still sped up though, but even with that, it took a while. This took me, I think, like 3 or 4 hours to do all in all, from sketching to inking and everything else. Yeah, and so what I just did actually is going to create a mark, so I'm going to have to go over that. I'm sorry that my head is in the way. And now I'm using a gel pen to create the bands of the backpacks, because I wanted them to be to stand out at least a little bit, so that they would really come across as being students. And with the brush pen, I was worried that that was not going to happen. I'm speeding up the video more and more in different areas just because they're just washes. Over here, I slowed down just to show you I love doing this. Sometimes I go around a person to create almost like an opposite halo effect, a shadow behind them so that your eye is drawn towards them. Sally Nixon's an artist on Instagram that I'm obsessed with, and I kind of learned that trick from her. Now I'm grabbing my black ink brush, so I want to be very careful where I use it because my background is black, right? So I don't want to darken everything too much, but I'm just adding some definition in the hair, sometimes a little bit too much. Maybe I didn't really need it as much. I wish I had just done that for her hair, the main character, and left everything else alone, but I did not do that. So I kind of overworked it and then played around with other brushes to kind of dull that out a little bit because we don't want everything to be nice and contrasted. Some details were lost and that's fine. But so that's me kind of playing around with the black, which is way stronger, way more contrasted. And now I'm going back in with some gray and adding some washes in various areas. This is where, you know, you tweak and you add your details. You can either rework it too much or not enough. The key is to go slow, right? And now I'm going back in again with the ink brush and then the gel pen and vice versa, going back and forth between the two to add some shading and then to add definition. So the gel pen's there for fine detail. The ink washes are there for more dramatic contrast. Now I'm going in with my gel pen to add a little bit of detail to her so that she sticks out a little bit more than everybody else, right? She has a little bit more detail and now she has a little bit of white. And I'm pretty much done, right? Now I can go in and rework things. I think I reworked the background because it was too shiny and I could see the difference between the two, at least in person. And now I'm going in with my ink, my gel pen in order for it to be less shiny. But the key here is just you work and you rework until it looks the way you want it to. I feel like it's darker than it needed to be, but I'm pretty satisfied with it. Day 1 of Inktober is done. So now we're going to look at day 29, which is for the word shoes. I used a picture from the account The Doggist. He goes around all over and takes pictures of dogs and asks their owners little tidbits about them. The reason why I'm doing this second example is to show you the difference of how you can go about outlining something. So in this case, my outline, my drawing of the bow is there as a guide as to where the little studs of these shoes should go. And that's the whole point of this drawing, right? Is that I love this. I had saved this image a long time ago. I wanted to draw it, and then it's working perfectly for this prompt for shoes because these shoes are totally funky. So instead of drawing the outline of what I drew and going over it, I am drawing in very small circles, which is very similar to stippling, right? Except they're like full on circles so they can look like studs. And then I'm going in and I'm adding some slightly darker lines in parts of the bow, right? To make it kind of contrasted so that we can see the definition of that shape. Then I'm going about and outlining, and as you can tell on the pant leg, for some of the details, I'm doing some stippling instead of doing straight line work. Again, now I'm going and working on the second shoe, and the same thing. Instead of going over the outline the way that you normally would, I'm creating lines of small circles to give the illusion of the studs that are on the shoes in my visual aid. Again, this visual aid was from Instagram, not from Google Images, and it's something that I had wanted to draw anyway. Now I'm going to start working on the dog. I'm outlining him, and again, I am not outlining him the way I normally would. I'm creating hatching, so diagonal lines that are somewhat parallel to create the illusion of fur immediately, right? If I had done like a straight line outline, it would have looked way more cartoony. This is going to look cartoony anyway, but it would have looked even more unrealistic if I had outlined everything in a straight line instead of in hatchings to create the illusion of fur. So I'm adding some everywhere. Then you saw me kind of erase all the lines. I waited for everything to dry before I erased. Now I'm using my gray ink brush pen, not for much. I'm just blocking out the areas that I know are going to be darker. So I'm working on the shoes, I'm working on the pants, and then I'm adding some details on the dog. For the dog is just to add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of definition. It also means that I'll have less work to do with my hatchings and cross hatchings, mostly hatchings, just so that it's always in the right direction. And again, I'm doing the same thing I did for drawing 1, which is to use my gel pens to create some more dramatic outlines so that there's a little bit more contrast and so that there's more of a precise outline to everything. And now I'm really going in with my 0.3, I think it's my 0.3, and I'm adding hatchings slowly to create the illusion of fur. And I'm going slowly so that if I mess up or I don't like the way it looks, it won't attract too much of attention when you're looking at it. And then I did the same thing to add details onto the shoes and onto the pant leg just so that all of the lines seem a little bit more precise, and so that there's slightly more detail and shading onto each section, especially because a drawing like this doesn't have nearly as much going on as the first example I did, which had like tons of people and details. This really has very little, so we want everything that's here to have as much definition as possible. And I wanted to use as much of my gel pens as possible as opposed to ink washes, so you could see that you really don't need fancy materials in order to really have fun with Inktober. Really, one gel pen and one pencil and one eraser is plenty in order for you to create something that you're proud of and something that's challenging. So for me, these shoes, these bows were definitely quite challenging. I realized later that I wanted to go around the little circles in order to create a stronger outline, but I'm really glad I didn't just follow the shape I had drawn initially, because that would have made them look really, really cartoony and not nearly as precise as they do this way. And again, I am going with my one ink wash, but if you only had, for example, a Crayola gray marker or black Crayola marker, you could get the exact same look as I do right here. It would be ideal if you were using a brush instead of the marker tip itself, but you could totally use the marker tip itself as well. So the key here is that whether you do a drawing that has just two components or you do a drawing that has a bunch of them, 31 days, 31 drawings, it's a lot of work. So some days you're going to do a little bit less. Some days you're not going to have enough time to really obsess over the details. For me, it was first the restriction of the prompt of shoes, the restriction of then trying to only use the gel pen to show you guys how to create a cool drawing just using that was the challenge I gave myself with this particular drawing, and I'm pretty happy with the way that it turned out. I hope that this will motivate you to draw. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and happy drawing to you all. Hooray for Inktober! Bye!